Okay, so to answer the question that Toby posed right at the end of his talk about the Romans and the influence they had here at Pendinas, I suspect they didn't have any whatsoever. By now, if we'd done quite a bit of excavation altogether on the site, and stuff was in the 1930s, we would have found quite a bit of Roman pottery. There's nothing whatsoever to know. There's one Roman coin from the site, but you do find Roman coins just about everywhere. But yes, we would have got a lot of Roman pottery, so it may well be the site was abandoned before the Romans came here and took over this part of Wales in about 70, 80 AD. Anyway, there we are. We've seen this photograph before. And again, Toby just emphasised just how many hill forts and small defended settlements we have in Wales. There's several hundred, not thousands of them. And in case you don't know, that's where we are. One of many. And we're not the first ones to excavate at Pendinas. This is Darrell Ford's excavations in the 1930s. He's the one with the hat in the centre there, and with his workforce. And just keep this in mind, this photograph, for the end of the talk. You see there in the background Aberystwyth. And again, it's a bit of an unusual hill fort. It's two hill forts in one, connected together by the isthmus. The main hill fort with the Wellington Monument on it there, very heavily defended on this side by banks and ditches. And the so-called North Fort, that's almost circular part there, quite lightly defended, just a single bank and ditch. There's some debate about is one earlier than the other, and the assumption that passes to me, this is the earlier fort, and this is secondary. That's based upon no factual evidence whatsoever, that's just speculation. And this is taken from one of, Toby's photographs. He made a 3D model from aerial photographs and converted this rather strange coloured model of Pendinas Fort. But what you're seeing here, quite interestingly, are all those little dimples along there, and they are sites of houses, probably round houses. And that's where we're excavating at the moment, so I'll say a bit more about those in a second. But what's interesting is that what you're seeing there just are the major ones, and the excavation we do at the moment, and when we look a bit more carefully, there's quite clearly an awful lot more of those house platforms on that hill fort. So you're not seeing them all. And simply when you get onto the... Simply what you have to do is when you've got steep land, you have to cut a terrace to build your house, to get a flat area. The more gentle land, you cut a very gentle terrace. And of course, over 2,000 years, that's then just disappeared. And on the flat land on the top, of course, you don't... You don't need to build a terrace at all, you just build on the flat land. So on the top of the hill fort, there would have been houses, but you can't see the evidence of them on the surface at the moment. If you excavate, you found them. And so back to our excavation 2 years ago, and also Darrell Ford's excavation in the 1930s. That's the photograph taken when Darrell Ford was there, and this is our excavation 2 years ago, taken roughly from the same position. And what we're trying to do, or one of the objectives of this project we're trying to do excavation, is trying to get some idea of the dating evidence, the date of the fort, when it came to use, how long it was in use for, and how it was used. And of course, in the 1930s, Ford didn't have the benefit of scientific dating, radiocarbon dating we can do now, a thing called OSL dating, which I'll show a bit about at the end. And also the other big problem we have with Iron Age Wales is the very marked absence of artefacts. You don't find much. I mean, Toby shows some spectacular finds here, but they are the exception. And what you don't find are the run-of-the-mill things, the bits of pottery, the stone artefacts, other things that just make up daily life. We just don't find them, they're just not there. And they're very useful for dating things and actually giving some indication how people lived. And so Ford was really, when he did his work, was really sort of guessing about how old things were. And that was a big problem which we're trying to solve at the moment. So anyway, what we did 2 years ago was re-excavate some of Ford's trench on the south entrance. And very quickly, we discovered that the photographs that Ford took were just a little snapshot on a particular day. And what he did, we now know, is once these photographs had been taken, he carried on excavating and actually took away much of what you see there. So when we came to excavate, we expected to find these walls, these other things here. They just weren't there, they'd just been removed. Incidentally, what you see here is what you wouldn't do nowadays. You wouldn't put two small boys in a hole there and balance rocks above their heads and prop up the walls with bits of fencing post. It's all a bit... Anyway, so we pretty quickly abandoned opening up Ford's trenches and moved a bit further away from where we excavated. Although we did find little bits which he'd left in position. So there's his photograph in 1930s, 1933. And if you look at those stones there they are now. This is Toby's reconstruction of what that South Gateway may have looked like just over 2,000 years ago, based upon Ford's excavation and what you can see on the surface. It's quite a simple gateway as hill forts go. Some of the sites you dig, these big hill forts are really complex ways into the forts. This is quite a simple gateway at the south entrance. The north entrance to the fort is much more complex. Oh, doesn't matter too much. Anyway, so in 2 years ago, once we realised that we fruitless attempt to try and reopen Ford's trenches, we moved a bit, extended our trenches up inside the fort a bit, looking at some of those house platforms which are visible on the surface and on the aerial photographs. In this case, this is the entrance area here. There's one house platform. You can see it cut into the bedrock. And an upper one up there. So two house platforms, which proved to be much more fruitful in the way of excavations. The other thing to note in this photograph is Ford was employing simply labourers to do his digging. And I suspect that he only went up to site occasionally, perhaps once a week he went up there, look what's going on, and said, carry on chaps, just dig a bit more and I'll be back next week. And what they were doing was just going down to the most solid archaeology. So when they got walls, that was okay, and when they found bedrock, that was okay. But subtle things, they tended to miss. So it doesn't look much there, but those little layer of stones, in fact, is the surface of a trackway, which would have come through the entrance into the fort. And that was just completely removed in the 1930s. And that's the edge of Ford's trench there. So these are subtle things which were just missed in those excavations then. And those platforms turned out to be really interesting. This is the so-called lower one. Rock cut. This is really hard bedrock. I can assure you, with our steel tools, you have a hard job getting into that bedrock. It's really tough stuff. Well, they cut into it, made a level platform. In this case, it's not a house on that platform at all. There's some other things happening there. But what's really interesting is they constructed a drain, which that's a capping stone to that drain. Of course, once you've done this, water runs down the slope onto your platform. So you have a drain to take away the water. And when we excavated this, when we had rain, it still worked. The water still flowed out at both ends of this drain. The so-called upper platform is this one here. We did a narrow trench in this. If you keep this in mind for a second or two, it's rock cut. Notice this very large circular hole here and other things. That's A post hole, where they've put a timber post in the ground. And simply what you do is if you've got nice soft ground, you can dig a hole quite simply, put your post in the ground, pack it around with stones to support it, and there you are. And that's what it looks like when you first find it. That's a post hole which had the timbers just rotted over the past few thousand years, but the stones, the packing stones are still there in place. And if you're really lucky in some circumstances, as the post has rotted, the stones remain in situ, and you actually find the position of the post exactly, its shape and its size, and sometimes you can tell if it's been squared or not. In this case, it's all collapsed. And when you take it out, that's the hole, in this case, you're left with. A circular hole, flat-bottomed, carved into bedrock. I mean, how on earth do you do that? I mean, we'd have real trouble nowadays chiseling that out with steel tools. But they did it with quite primitive tools. I mean, I suspect they must have had iron tools to do this. But even so, someone's probably spent a few weeks carving that post hole out. And there must be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these across that hill fort to have taken all the houses. A huge amount of effort just going to actually constructing the houses before you even get to build them and put up the timber work. And the other thing we had here were these, thank you, these what we call palisade trenches, where again you dig a trench and you put upright posts in the trench and pack around with stones to support it. And of course the same thing happens, the posts rot, but the stones remain. And in this case, just there, well, a few finds from the site, that little circular disc, which I'll say a bit about in a second. Because there we are. There's Julie. With a few finds from the site, a spindle whorl, which I'll say what it is, but these are finds that year, 2 years ago. This is virtually it. This is what you walk away with after 3 weeks excavation away of finds. A spindle whorl, a stone bead, and an amber bead. An amber is particularly an interesting substance. It looks like stone there, but when you hold it to the light, you can see it's orange, translucent orange in colour. It occurs it's probably from the east coast of England, the Baltic area. It's fossilised resin, pine resin, and it washes up on the coast. Most of the Baltic area, so it gets onto the east coast of England and Scotland. It does occasionally find its way into the west coast of Britain, but more like it's been traded from the east coast. But it has magical properties. It looks like stone, but it's translucent. It floats, and also it holds electric charge. So if you do get a decent sized piece and rub it, you can actually get a spark from it. So that's been a real magical object a few thousand years ago. And spindle whorls, this is what they're used for. They're for spinning wool. They're just little weights on a spindle, and you just twist it round, spin it round, and tease out the thread to make a long thread. And the smaller the weight, the finer the thread. So those small ones will make an extremely fine thread, and some big ones will make sort of chunky stuff. And these are one of probably most common finds on an Iron Age archaeological site are spindle whorls, simply because they survive really well. You know, you can't really destroy them unless you crush them.
And they're easily lost as well.
They're probably used to lose. That's right, exactly. So this year, in Easter time, 4 weeks, March, April, we returned to the site and looked at the north entrance to South Fort, which is there, which again, Ford had done an awful lot of work here. So we weren't quite reopening his trench, we were actually working alongside where he'd worked to try and get some more evidence out from how this fort would have functioned and also for the dating of it. There's our trenches, 4 trenches opened up. Quite clearly, this is the entrance. You would come up, say it's quite a complex entrance here. You would come up from up the trackway, through an entrance just there, just off the side of the photograph, up through here, curved round, and into the main entrance just here, with possibly another gateway just there as well. So it's a very, very complex way into the fort. Again, this is Ford's photograph. We're not quite sure where it is. It's somewhere around the north entrance of one of his trenches. But it's, again, you see it's quite a messy excavation. And how on earth actually you excavate something like that, I don't know. I mean, it's about that wide. So how you actually get in it and dig it out in the first place is a bit of a mystery. But actually, once you've done so, how on earth you know what's going on, it'd be a real problem. And you can see it's just bits of stone just piled up everywhere. So we're not quite sure where this is. But I think we could probably go back in the winter, Toby, and try and, with the photographs on site, and try and work out where they are. Unfortunately, this hasn't got a background in it, so it's a bit more difficult. Some have backgrounds, so you can see where you are. So this one, Ford dug a trench here, so we're standing on top of the big defensive bank, looking down. Below there would be a very big ditch, of which we didn't even think about excavating. It'd be enormous. It'd be 4 metres deep and 8 metres wide. Huge thing. But out here is a little tiny, what we call a counterscarp bank, a bank that's on the outside of the ditch, which is quite small. And that's where it is there, just again, Aberystwyth in the distance. You see the size of the bank, tiny little sort of stone-built bank. And what we were trying to do there was trying to go beneath the bank, take it away in that section, to try and get some evidence which in the form of charcoal or something else which can date, scientifically date, which we've got those samples. We did get, so we were lucky enough actually to come across a small pit right below that bank which had charcoal in it. So we were able to get that dated scientifically. We haven't done so yet. Once we finish this current excavation, we will get all that work done. But we have got some means now of actually dating that particular bank, which is, progress over what Ford was doing. And again, I've just put this photograph in here. This is looking up into the gateway of the fort, which has just been here on the horizon, this gate. But keep your eye on that little bush there, little hawthorn bush, just to remind you where you are. This is 1930, I think probably 36, I think this was taken. And there's that hawthorn bush. Still there, amazingly. It hasn't actually grown much either. So we were just working just behind the entrance, behind the big defensive bank. And we were a bit mystified at first as to what this sort of line of stones was there, this curving line of stones. You see it there as well. I couldn't really figure out what's going on. But it became clear very quickly. It was one of Ford's excavation trenches. You wouldn't do this nowadays. What he was doing, as he dug, when he found walls, he just followed them along and dug out in front of them like that, exposing the wall face. So we just dug out what he had backfilled essentially there to expose the wall again. And you wouldn't do that nowadays for several reasons, but the main one being is what you're doing there is divorcing all the interesting archaeology on this side from what's happening over there. And you can't link them together. You've chopped off that connection. So you would never do it like that nowadays. But that's been done. That's the way it was. But you see here this stone wall. What's quite interesting here is they've all incorporated river cobbles or probably beach cobbles into this stone wall. I mean, why would you do that when you've got a site which is on bedrock, which you can quarry out bedrock, and yet they went to the trouble to go down probably to the beach and carry these cobbles back up to make their wall? which probably doesn't make such a good wall as a good squared stone. One theory about that, we're discussing that quite, as you do on site all the time, and we're wondering actually by the time they came to build this wall, had all the ditches which were dug through bedrock silted up, and so actually there was no obvious source for good quality building stone. So actually they're forced to use these rather inferior beach cobbles. And we took the opportunity to dig a slight section through that bank by the entrance to try and, again, we're looking here for dating evidence, samples to actually scientifically date in the form of charcoal and other means. But what we did find, rather surprisingly, is about 1.5 metres down in that massive bank was some glass, which we got very excited about. It's very fine glass, and what we're thinking it was at that time was that it was early medieval glass, probably 6th, 7th century glass, perhaps Merovingian glass from France, which is very fine, thin glass. That was our thinking at the time. We took it to the National Museum to get their advice about this, and they're a bit sniffy about that theory, to say the least. They didn't like it. They didn't like it being ancient glass. They thought it was more likely to be modern. But how on earth you get pieces of glass of a vessel like that 1.5 metres down into a quite clear defensive bank which has been there for a few thousand years, I don't know. But they will run some scientific tests. They can run a XRF test which determines the chemical composition of the glass, which will tell you if it's modern or not. So that's still to be done. But so they weren't impressed by our theory. And the other thing you do is, I mentioned this scientific dating, OSL dating, optical stimulated luminescence. And what you're doing there, and don't explain to me, don't ask me how it works, but what essentially you can do is date the last time that silts or soils or whatever was exposed to sunlight. So this is Helen Roberts of the university here taking some samples from this layer here. And of course what you have to do is take the samples in the dark, because you can't take a sample and expose it to sunlight, otherwise you reset the clock to 0 again. So here you see some skilled volunteers on an exceptionally difficult job, having to sit on a bit of black plastic, and below there is Helen and her colleague taking the samples in the dark. I say I don't know how the technique, how it works, but it takes a long, long time. It takes several months to get results. You have to sort of do this sort of counting of the sample for a long, long period of time. I think sometime we took one from an excavation we did in South Pembrokeshire, and now they say it's going to take 2 or 3 years to get results. To let it, I don't know why, how it works, but Helen's not here in the room, is she? She'd perhaps explain if she were. So that's where we were at Easter. So this time, in September, we've come back, and we've come back to where we were 2 years ago, to the south entrance, and looking at what we call then the upper terrace of the house platform. And that's our trench we dug 2 years ago. So it actually exposed now the whole of that house platform. So those who were there this morning for the tours would have seen this. And what you can see here is this house platform here we're doing. But when you start to look, that's one that was excavated by Ford in the 1930s. But you can just about make out others. And when you look really carefully, you can see an awful lot more. And I think the whole of this hill fort on this slope is just covered in house platforms. I say once you get to the top bit, you don't need to build a platform or dig a platform, you just build a house on the flat land. So it looks though, if you go into the trouble to dig out through really, really hard bedrock a platform to build a house on, there's almost certainly going to be houses right across the whole lot where it's easy to build houses. So one suspects the whole hill fort interior is just covered in roundhouses. Several hundred people living there. Remember this? This is 10 days ago. A heat wave. It seems a distant memory now. There we are, struggling in the hot weather to deturf that area. It was hard work. But we did it, and there's the platform beginning to emerge. And there it is with the topsoil removed. There's that trench from 2 years ago, and that post hole, that circular post hole, it's just there. And one suspects we're going to find a whole series across here and hopefully get the shape of a house there. We're hoping to get other things that go with it, perhaps some floor levels. One we hope to get a hearth, central fireplace, which is a roundhouse, and other information as well. And we had the 3 artefacts came from this trench. So I would hope that they weren't the only 3 artefacts in the whole of this area. But you never know. So that's where we are at the moment. So those who went up this morning would have been pretty much that situation. We've done a bit more work since then. This is 2 days ago. But you know, that's where we are. So we're getting down to things. It wasn't always plain sailing. This is back in Easter time. We had some pretty bad weather then, if you remember rightly, back in March and April, and our tent completely blew over. I said our portaloos. We now know how to tie them down properly. After that happened, the chap who comes up and says, "This is how you tie them down," and they're okay now. And just to end, that first slide I showed you of Darrell Ford's workers, there we are. This year, this is exactly the same spot as Ford stood in the 1930s. Aberystwyth has grown a bit since then, but essentially it's the same site. And there we are. And just thanks to all the volunteers who are still working on the site. Without them, it wouldn't be possible. We wouldn't get the work done. They've been fantastic, either working wet weather or really, really hot weather as it was last week. So thank you for them. And that's my talk. It's still 2 weeks to go. So who knows what the results will be after another 2 weeks. But there we are. That's where we are at the moment.